Hi, my name's Roger. I'm doing some videos for the Extinction Rebellion on various aspects of bringing about radical political change, which is my research area at King's College London, as it happens. So, yeah, like with the other videos, it's a bit rough and ready, so I'm just going to go through it in a bit of a incoherent way, but hopefully you'll get the general gist. So as in with the other videos, first of all, is a disclaimer. I'm not making this video with any particular agenda for how, what regimes should be changed and why there should be a change. Obviously, I have a general humanistic ethic, so I would hope that it'd be used for those purposes. But that's not the subject. It's about the subject of this video. It's about the general mechanics, basically, of a political transition and how sortition works. If you don't know what sortition means, I'll tell you in a minute. Okay, so what we're assuming here is that the regime has fallen or it's in chaos and you're in a position to bring about structural political change. So as I'm sure lots of people know, lots of people say, yeah, that's all great, you can change the regime or bring down the regime, but what comes next? So what I'm going to tell you is what arguably is the optimal scenario about what comes next. It doesn't mean it's definitely going to come next, and it doesn't mean you're definitely going to succeed. Okay, what it means is this is probably your highest probability chance that you're going to get a progressive, humane outcome. Okay, so the basic sort of big takeaway of this video is the main way to fundamentally change a society is to bring about constitutional change, i.e. not in what happens, but in the institutions that decide what happens. Okay, so historically, usually this means setting up what you might call a national assembly. In different revolutions and rebellions, they're called different things, like a convention, but the upshot of it is people come together to decide what's going to happen. Okay, and there's three sort of ways in which this tends to go. Again, these can get mixed up and they go from one to the other. But the first one is a symbolic assembly. So let's say the government is already in place and you set up an assembly which formally doesn't have any power, but shames, in inverted commas, the government by being the voice of the people or claiming to be so. Okay, and we'll talk in a minute about the people that will be in that assembly. Okay, the second scenario is what you might call a parallel institution, like an assembly. So what this means is the government's still in place, but you set up a national assembly which has some real political power, i.e. people are looking to that assembly which in many ways has more legitimacy to the corrupted political system. And then you might get some sort of, messing about basically between the two institutions, a sort of power play situation. Okay, so the third one is like the classical model of revolution where another assembly is set up and then the old, a national assembly is set up and the old political structure like the aristocracy or some corrupted democracy or whatever collapses and the new assembly becomes the formal constitutional situation. So as you can see, like you may start with the symbolism and then go into a parallel situation and then go to a full-on classical situation. Or alternatively, you could get to a parallel situation and the two things could develop together and they could become consolidated, as you might say. So this has happened in Porto Alegre, I think in South America, where there's there's neighbourhood assemblies in the city that send representatives and there's a parallel sort of city government and the two work together. So who's to say, right? But you can sort of see that basically that's the way to go. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how these assemblies should be constituted. So in talking about this, again, need to emphasize that there's no absolute guarantees. There's no 100% guarantee that people won't get corrupted. People are corruptible. Everyone knows the phrase, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Okay. So what we're trying to do here is a better bad job than the really bad jobs, as you might say. Okay, so what can we start off by saying? Well, this is mainly directed at people that are in what formerly are called Western democracies. Okay, so what we do know is that these are being corrupted by corporate power, by the international elite, the rich and powerful, whatever you want to call them. Okay, and what they do is they game the political system by giving money to political parties and promoting their agenda through having loads of money and putting that into the system. So the alternative to this, so the problem with representational democracy in the context of a global capitalist system is that it's very difficult for those representatives to reflect the will of the people. Okay, so the solution to this is sortition. So the idea of sortition is just a posh word basically, which means that you don't have a voting system. People are selected by chance. So let's say you've got 10,000 people and you choose 1 in 100 people by chance to sit on the assembly. Now, the beauty of this is you get a cross-section of the national community or the regional community or the city community. So like half the people are going to be women, half the people are going to be men. You're going to have ethnic minorities represented there and so on and so forth. So the great advantage of that is it has a popular legitimacy because people can see viscerally that it reflects themselves. They're not going through elites. The second big advantage is these people aren't going to be corruptible in so much as they're only there for a limited amount of time, and they'll look at an issue like a new constitutional settlement or a major issue around inequality or democracy or the climate crisis, and experts can come and talk to those people over a week or 2 months, whatever's appropriate, and then they'll come to some consensus building process or voting process whereby they decide what should happen. And the great advantage of that is whatever they decide has some popular legitimacy because it's evidently not corruptible. Now, obviously, there's lots of nitty-gritty on who gets to talk to them and how they make that decision, which I'm not going to go into because I haven't got that much time. So you can research that by looking up sortition if you like. But as academics have spent their lives trying to design processes to minimise that sort of corruption. The main point here is that it's fundamentally different from representational democracy. Okay, so you've got dictatorship, you've got representational democracy, and then you've got sortition. That's how different it is. Okay. Okay, last little point on this is, again, there's no sort of final right and wrong on this, but one of the problems with direct democracy, which is having everyone in a National Assembly voting, is the problem that not everyone gets all the information. There's a number of problems with it, but one key problem is, you can't have the whole country sitting down for 2 weeks to study all the ins and outs of the climate crisis. So if you want to come to what you might call a rational decision, then people need information and they need time to deliberate over that information in the light of their commonly held values. So the great advantage of a sortition deliberative democracy sort of model is you have a proper representational number of people and you have enough time for them to make a decision which makes sense because you want to make the right decision. So you can see that that has big advantages over a direct democracy situation where you've got hundreds of people trying to make decisions all at once. Okay. The last point to make is obviously you can have some sort of hybrid, right? So when this starts happening around the world, which I'm sure it's going to sooner or later, is you could have a little bit of voting, you could have a sortition element, you could have a direct democracy element. Okay, so I'm not going to go into, all those details. The point I'm trying to make is this is the direction of travel. And it's essential, I would argue, that when uprisings happen, they have in place a sortition agenda. Because arguably one of the biggest problems with uprisings over the last 30 years is there's an amazing uprising, the people come to the street, and then there's an election. And 2 things can happen. During that election, all the money comes out and corrupts the election. Or the representative, the people that are voted in, become corrupted as soon as they enter Parliament by big money. And so you just get a continuation of the system and you have to have an uprising again in 5 years' time. Do you see what I mean? So this is the key element in actually doing something that makes sense. It's a bigger change as moving from, as I say, a dictatorship, an aristocratic regime to a democratic regime. Okay, so the other big problem before I finish in the literature, as it might say, is backsliding. So one of the biggest problems when you have regime change is the elites and the people whose power is going to be taken away don't like it. And they tend to do everything they can, including breaking all the rules they can, explicitly or implicitly, to stop the uprising from actually reflecting the people's will. Okay, so there's a load of ways of doing this. The upshot of it is if you have an uprising and then you say, great, we're passing it over to the Sortition Assembly and everyone go back to work, then you're making a big mistake. Because usually in successful uprisings and revolutions, what happens is you basically have a victory and then the situation backslides as the elites try to regain control and the people have to come back onto the street. So the movement has to still be there to correct the corruption which almost inevitably will happen. So the optimal situation is to have a street movement and a National Assembly in a synergistic relationship. They feed off each other so that the whole system can be guided into a new equilibrium of something resembling a sensible, civilized society. And if we get to that, then, as far as I'm concerned, we've done some good. Okay. The last point is about the global system. I mean, I'm covering a lot of ground here. It's a quick tick box thing. So having an uprising in a particular country, as lots of people have pointed out, is a little bit tricky because the international capitalist system and all the rest of it is going to try and undermine it. So there needs to be non-violent uprisings in countries all around the world, or at least a significant critical mass of them. And this isn't as fantastical as it might sound, because revolutions in the past tend to be contagious. Think of 1989, the Arab Spring. So if there's a big uprising in the UK in the next few weeks with Extinction rebellion, then it's highly, highly likely, almost inevitable, that it's going to happen in other countries. Now, that opens up the same dilemmas on an international level as on a national level. So basically, I'm going to say ditto internationally. In other words, you need to have an international assembly which is sortition based, i.e. from the citizens all around the world. And of course the critical issue here is the citizens all around the world have to realise their own power, that they themselves can make universal moral decisions about how the world should operate, and they're just as good as doing that as all the people that have made such a mess of things over the last 30 years. So we don't need all those professionals, all those academics like me, to be in there. What we need is those people to be in there making the decision, and the other guys are on the periphery of it, putting in their opinion. But it's the people themselves that decide, and the people's will is translated into action through an international assembly based upon sortition. And that's probably the best bet, in my humble opinion, and in other people's humble opinion. So best of luck, everyone.